Welcome to episode 3 of the CEO's Cyber Briefing podcast. Today I'm joined by Todd Wade, a cybersecurity leader who has been on the front lines of private equity carve-outs, IPOs, fintech scale-ups, and even the fast-moving world of Web3. Todd isn't here to talk about theory. He's here to share real stories. What happens when security is left too late, the pitfalls he sees leaders fall into time and time again, and practical steps CEOs can take to protect value during high-stake moments. Whether you're leading a startup or steering a global business, Todd's insights will help you cut through the noise and see cybersecurity as a business issue and not just an IT one. I'm David Fleckner, and this is the CEO's Cyber Briefing podcast. Enjoy. Todd, welcome to the show. Todd, one thing that really fascinates me when I speak to people like you is, why did you choose a career in cybersecurity? What kind of led you on this?
I've been in tech for a long time, and one of the things about tech for 20 plus years is cyber has always been an integral part of any technology, CIO or CTO. But in the past few years, it's separated out to its own kind of domain. And as this separation started to happen, as we started to get more and more digital attacks, as we started to expand the internet and everything, to me, it was just way more interesting work. I just find it such a fascinating field, and I find it just so rewarding to do some of the work I do in cybersecurity. And so there was a pivot to me as I was running, as a CTO, I pivoted over to strictly cyber work about 7-8 years ago. Even though I've been doing cyber work for far longer than that, now it's dedicated towards cybersecurity. And I think since I've done that move, it's been way more rewarding than what it was previously.
Yeah, and you've obviously worked across multiple sectors. You've worked private equity, fintech, sports streaming. What's the one thing that you've learned that applies to all of them when it comes to cybersecurity? Is there a common theme across those different sectors?
I think there's some definite common themes you'll find across the sectors. Oftentimes, it's just a lack of basic hygiene. So you see all these great security tools, you see all this latest and greatest, things you could buy, but over and over again, organizations get caught out by not doing the basics right. They don't know where their assets are. Many don't even know where they are. What I mean by that is, if you're not monitoring all of your assets because you don't know where they are, that means you have blind spots, and those blind spots can be exploited. And the second thing you see a lot is access control, identity and access management. You're finding a lot of the cyber criminals don't even need to hack your systems. They can just log right in. And these are things that are impacting every organization. And you'll see a lot of innovation on how to help companies control that risk. But this is, again, there gaps appear. And if you don't understand these gaps, this is where companies get caught out over and over.
Do you think in general, most companies, because, there's some fantastic vendors out there, and these vendors do great things, but do you think the majority of, certainly from experience for the companies you've worked in, are companies buying too much of a tech stack and relying on that rather than some of the basic, more human type things?
You'll find a lot of noise in the cybersecurity vendor market, and there's a lot of chat about this. And so if anyone goes to an information security trade show, as an example, and you look around, every single vendor looks like they can solve every single problem.
Yeah.
And it's clearly not true, but this is how a lot of them come across. And so you find a lot of people buying tools they shouldn't buy. I find a lot of situations of them buying a great product, but then they don't have the support, or they don't have the manpower to actually run the product. So it's not doing the job it should happen. So you see a lot of misalignment, a lot of duplication on tool sets, and particularly, for large organizations, this is a problem. So yeah, so it's a lot of that happening. So You have to really step back sometimes, and sometimes this is where personally I add a lot of value is you need an outside perspective to come in to offer that outside perspective because coming from the inside, you're looking at the tools, you're looking at the problem from the inside perspective, but an outside perspective coming in can really offer you a more holistic view of your program and make some real positive changes to improve your risk levels.
Yeah, and something I've seen more recently in the last couple of months actually is, clients that are going through, say, mergers or sort of acquisitions. With that comes the complexity of, bringing systems together and merging those systems. And I know you've obviously been through situations where you've been involved when a company's being bought, sold, or kind of split up. What's the biggest mistake that you see companies make in those situations, and what is the ultimate cost?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake, but everyone does due diligence. So
Yeah,
beforehand, you'll hire a big four organization, come in there and they'll do a great due diligence on the pre-acquisition of what is being divested, and every investor will want to know that. And so they come in and they look at the tech stack, they look and put this whole thing together. The challenge you have with those, it's about how much due diligence. The simple fact is, a lot of every time there's stuff simply even the IT leaders don't know in their organization. There are processes connected, running, you just don't properly understand. So when you actually do the separation, you're going to be hit with a stream of unknowns. Unknowns. This is a guaranteed fact. You just simply because of the fact there's just things that you're not be able to anticipate. And the teams that do these types of separations, they understand that, know how to adjust and pivot to this. And so this is just something to expect. A lot of times the emotional impact of the companies, not necessarily the teams like I work on, but it's the companies of the stress they get put under. You have to do a lot of people management to manage that stress level because they're dealing with stuff that many times the most stressful situation that they've ever been in a corporate environment. So
yeah.
yeah, some things like that I would say would be front and center.
Okay. And I'm sure you've walked into situations in the past where you've had to fix something. You've had to fix, something security related from sort of day one. What do you do first? I know it will vary depending on the situation, but when you step into a new company for the first time, what's your kind of protocol in terms of how do you approach fixing their security?
There's an ongoing joke. The security budget always increases after a ransomware attack.
Yeah,
Always, always. And so you're thinking, you probably could have saved yourself money, investing in your security beforehand. On the other side, I'm seeing examples of the security budget actually getting decreased because there hasn't been a ransomware attack, and they're reducing the budget because they think they're safe, which
yeah,
is another irony and completely wrong if that's happening. So the two things on my radar, it depends on the situation, but if I don't know where the assets are and I don't have proper monitoring in place to detect threats, I'm going to lose sleep on that. Those are the two aspects for me that are incredibly important. So these are just the basics. You have to understand what you're protecting. You have to understand if you are attacked or you're being threatened, can you detect that? And what the options are for that. We kind of say, look, these are two of the basics you need to you need to work on right away. Yeah. So there's a couple of things I would start thinking about, but again, it depends on the context of what you're stepping into.
yeah. Um, and in that situation, then, are you're evaluating what they have in place already, and then you're making those kind of recommendations based off what their kind of base level is.
What it depends. I mean, obviously, that would move on to some sort of gap analysis of where they're at,
Right.
some sort of risk analysis. Are they using a risk-based approach? Are they prioritizing the right risk in their organization? Is their budget going towards the right risk? A lot of organizations are still stuck in compliance mode, so they just want to tick the boxes and move on. And to shift into actually a risk-based mode where they're focusing on the key risk is sometimes a really tough discussion to have for some organizations.
Okay. I know that a side gig of yours is you also invest in cybersecurity companies, so you're kind of well versed in that. investor world. So when you're talking to investors or deal teams about security, how do you make them listen? Because I know that's a big challenge for a lot of cybersecurity execs when they go into a company, because as you just pointed out, cybersecurity tends to be, it's a nice to have. It's not necessarily something that a lot of companies bring in expertise before they get breached. How are you having those sort of conversations, and how do you make them listen to what you're saying?
I think there's two aspects of this. You have the startup world, which let's take out cybersecurity companies from that conversation, but the typical startup world, they just are going to take way more risk to do this, and what you find is, unless they're financially or regulatory forced to, you'll find far greater risk. I've walked into organizations who have built their platforms with little mind of security. They've been hacked dramatically, and they didn't put any thought. They just wanted to get the market, show the product off, and sell it. This is how they were thinking. But the investment I do, I'm part of a really great group of investors at Cyber Club London. We're about 70 or 80 security leaders around the world that evaluate deals. We invest in cyber companies. The companies themselves are cyber experts. So you don't need to really drill down, because they're already doing that by default in their organizations. They
Yeah,
just are. They're going to get it. These guys are, a lot of our guys, founders are coming straight from the 8200 Israeli cyber units. This is all they do.
yeah, it's in their
so,
blood. Yeah,
so it's a different mindset than the typical startup, because a typical startup is going to be night and day versus a cyber startup. I would gather, because they're
yeah.
just going to put more. This is what they do. And they're going to be much more serious about how they build a product that is going to protect organizations. But in order to do that, their product has to be secure, and that's going to be really important.
So if we just take a normal sort of tech startup, then how are you, if you're being brought into that organization, let's say they're a fairly early funded, so Series B, Series C funded company, and they're bringing you in, what are you doing in terms of making them listen about the dangers and what you're going to bring to that organization? I know that has been a challenge, certainly from the CISOs I've worked with in the past.
I think there's some basics, like, are you aligning to a cyber framework like NIST CSF or CIS? And getting that alignment right, so it provides a baseline, I think is really important. And if you get this alignment right as a baseline and say, look, these are, you know, where you're at. This is where you cut just as a baseline, you want to hit these targets, because these frameworks are really good at enabling best practices. And from there, you would start just from that point. If, especially with a startup, they're not going to be able to do necessarily a risk-based approach, because it's going to be much more work. But at least they can do a basic hygiene and align themselves with some best practices with some of the leading frameworks there. And I think that's really important. Provide some structure, because you need to provide structure, and you need to provide them, a path for them to mature their models. Because, like I said, they're going to have more risk than the typical company as a startup,
Yeah.
but you'll be looking to improve this risk as they grow. But then there are some industries, if you're in financial services, however, you have to meet these. You're going to be stuck. You're going to be hit with regulatory needs where you don't have any choice. You have to
Yeah.
meet these, and to do that, you're going to have to make the investment in cybersecurity from day one, or you won't be compliant. You won't get the. You won't be able to have. You won't be able to operate without the right licenses.
And is there a story or an example that you use to kind of illustrate that point? Because, I'm sure you've been involved in uh, organizations where they've maybe not had the right level of security in place and they've been breached. That's cost them a lot of money. Is there an example that you tend to use or story in that situation?
I'll tell you, years ago there was an executive at an organization I was at, the most probably the best paid executive in the organization, responsible for most of the, not most, but a good portion of the sales, and he violated every cybersecurity policy you can imagine. He downloaded every virus. He just went and just, boom. People were replacing his laptop on a continual basis. One day he comes into my office and he's white. He's like, someone has just hacked and cleaned out one of his brokerage accounts. All right.
Wow.
And it was that moment where he got how important it is to do cybersecurity, how important it is for him personally to do it.
Mm.
After that moment, after that day switched, he was one of my biggest advocates for cybersecurity and took a whole different mindset. Where that story goes is if you can illustrate more personal stories to these founders or illustrate what can happen, how this can impact their business and their numbers personally, and draw that in languages that they understand. This is how you want to communicate and get your ideas across, and you'll have a better chance of success with these, because a lot of these founders and such aren't tech. They don't know cyber. And so they need that, because the last thing you want to do is to talk to any of the founders or the board and talk in a bunch of technical or cybersecurity mumbo jumbo. I have open vulnerabilities and, all this other kind of stuff. That's not a language they understand.
Yeah.
So you have to communicate in a language they'll understand in a ways that'll have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen it done both ways. I've seen CISOs blind CEOs with their knowledge, and it completely doesn't land. Whereas I've seen other CISOs who go in and speak the language of the CEO, and that's more complicated for them because it's not from a CISO's point of view. They want to talk technical, their language, but actually they've learned how to communicate that in a clearer way to a CEO.
So there's an interesting point you just touched upon here in the United Kingdom. The term CISO varies significantly depending on the organization. There's no common agreement on what that position is. And so you have organizations who will keep it at an executive level, will have it I would view as a CISO, um, as a key executive of the organizations who manage the risk for information security across the organization. But there are many examples where they will call a security manager or CISO who is doing IT security, reporting to the CTO. Other examples where the CISO is a GRC expert doing GRC. I've
Yeah.
seen examples of a CISO doing auditing at an organization. And so it's really, really interesting to see that, because whenever you hear that term, you kind of have to peel back and say, look, what exactly is this role doing? And what should it be doing? A lot of times I redefine that role for organizations, and we have a lot of discussions on how it should function, but it depends on the organization.
So do you think that's a potential problem then in the industry, that there's not really a clearly defined description of what a CISO is? Do you think that potentially puts off companies from?
If you look at the title, Chief Information Security Officer, okay, that implies a very senior role.
Yeah.
And for some reason, that senior role is oftenly demoted. Sometimes it's internal politics, sometimes a lack of understanding. Maybe they don't understand the security, but a good CISO is going to be a key business executive who understands cyber risk, how to work on information security risk across the organization to manage this. This is what they do. And to do this, they need a voice at the exco. They need a voice.
Yeah.
Because a lot of organizations, they just feed it and they have no presence at the exco. They don't. So everything they hear is funneled up to the CIO or to another executive, and they don't hear it, and there's no mechanism. And a lot of times the right person is in the role anyway. So again, why disparity on this that you see over here?
And at what point, in your opinion, should a company bring on a CISO? Again, let's keep with the kind of tech startup
Mm-hmm.
industry. Is there a trigger point, do you think? Is it sooner that the better, or is there?
I think at the minimum, you could bring in a fractional virtual CISO for a day a week. Even
Yeah.
that would help them provide some context. And even if it's unlimited, but limited budget, if you don't have the budget, and even that would provide you some really good value. So, and recommendations or leadership for the security. And there's some great virtual fractional CISOs out there that can do this. And that way the investment isn't that great. And as they scale up, they can, add more days and eventually get someone full time as they scale up and can afford someone full time.
Yeah. That was the whole thinking behind why we set up Centra. We were seeing that exact trend of tech startups in particular, not necessarily needing to bring in a full-time CISO just yet, but actually just bringing someone in a day, 2 days a week, like you say, gives them the foundation and the infrastructure that they need without making that big commitment.
And a lot of times they need a sounding board. They
Yeah.
need, they need a credible person as a sounding board. Am I doing the right thing? Am I going in the right direction? And that I find a lot is they just need some reassurance that they're on the right path.
Yeah. A couple of industries I'm quite interested in at the moment, and you could probably class these as fairly new industries, so kind of Web3 and blockchain. What's the one big risk in that space that CEOs aren't really thinking about right now?
The great for Web3 particularly, I've done some projects with this, and I was brought in for a large exchange, and they'd been hacked, and they needed someone to come in and help them navigate this, do an assessment, what went wrong. I went in there and started doing some due diligence on their platform, and this platform was zero security. In other words, it didn't even have encryption and transit. It didn't even have what you would consider just basic authentication mechanisms in there. So in other words, it was completely very easy for it to hack, and they lost a significant amount of money. Now, the interesting point is when you have a startup, let's say like a cybersecurity startup or some other tech startup, you have a certain trajectory. It's not really often that you start within 3 months, you have 100 million in assets in your environment. This group had hundreds of millions within 6 months because this is how Web3 works. And so as a normal startup, you improve your security, right? As you build and such, but you don't have 100 million in cryptocurrency in your environment, or you're not handling those kind of numbers. But in all these Web3 companies, it's a very different. They are like instantly have all the assets, and they haven't gone through that pipe. They're the same startup mentality, but the risk for this for them is
Yeah.
significantly worse. And unfortunately, you see all these attacks happening. And again, my guess, I don't know how, without being involved in a lot of the post work on some of these, I suspect a lot of the problems are pretty similar. They've developed it without the proper security, or they haven't done the right security, protocols, and they're getting caught out. And it's not easy. And it's worse because then you have nation states like North Korea coming at you. That's like when you get attacked by some of these nation states, they're going to come at you pretty hard,
Yeah.
and that just makes it worse for these organizations.
So I guess, with these kind of heavily regulated industries like blockchain and Web3, the advice to them would be to bring in expertise sooner rather than later.
They're not regulated. They have no. They're not accountable to any regulatory.
Okay.
So, like, they can accept tokens or a token exchange, or this is part of the problem too. All right, because there's no very very different than a fintech.
Right.
All right. Very, very different business model. Unless they're 100% sure of this, but I think unless there's a fiat element to this, or maybe the jurisdiction that they're operating in, I don't know. But a lot of the crypto startups don't have to answer to any regulatory body at all.
Mm.
So again, that just removes the leverage of security leverage that fintechs have and other financial service organizations have to improve their security.
So there's kind of less pressure on them to actually have the adequate security in place, but actually that they're so much more exposed.
Way more exposed, way
Yeah.
more exposed. There are so many stories about these groups getting compromised because of this.
What's your advice to a company who have offices across the world and they're trying to instill a cybersecurity culture? I know you've managed teams, um, yourself globally. How would a company go about that if they're trying to, embed this new culture of security in their company, but they've got teams spread out across the world? How would one go about
Uh,
doing that?
a couple things that ping to mind. You want a common baseline among the jurisdictions, common KPIs to hit across them. You want to standardize tool sets. The last thing you want is to mix your tool sets in different regions.
Yeah.
And so little things like that go a long way towards, running global teams across different environments, just as a starting point. And there's more stuff, but those that I would be some of the things that I'd be starting to think about.
And what would those kind of KPIs look like? Again, it may differ, but
Yeah, so you have the normal, mean time to respond, mean time to detect type capabilities. You've got your vulnerabilities. You've got other types like your vulnerability, your um, I those would be the three main ones, that they'd be looking at. Um, Another common one you have, you keep looking at the phishing statistics. This is always a common one. So how are they reacting to social engineering attacks across these jurisdictions? How are they responding, let's say, in Singapore versus India? And so things like that provide a common picture. So like a common dashboard that you can look at across your regions, but the regions have to be consistent. You can't use different measuring points between these regions.
and what have you done from experience again when it comes to, you've got your security team that you're managing, but then the wider part of the business? How do you go about instilling that culture into say sales teams or marketing teams? Because obviously it tends to be, if there's going to be a problem, it happens in that department, not your cyber team. So how would you go about instilling that confidence across the wider part of the business?
It's important people view security as a partner, because if I view the security team as the entire organization. I think we are all part of the security, and it shouldn't be a security team and the rest of the organization. This should be the message. You should be a partner, and your solution has to help the business. And what I mean by that is the business has to make money. This is the purpose of this, and you have to understand this. You have to understand how it makes money, and you have to understand, all right, how your security fits into this mission. Okay. You can have the tightest security of the world, but if this tight security impacts profit and reduces the chance of profitability, you have a problem. Okay. You have to be able to flexible, and you have to define solutions that, and especially scaling growth companies, which I've done plenty of work with, you need to help them scale. And for this, sometimes it's taking on more risk, but you have to understand that, and you have to enable them. You cannot, if you don't understand that, and if you tried some other, if you try to get more too restrictive, then it's not going to end well. Will not end well at all. So what your challenge with these organizations, I've seen numerous organizations I've walked into where they've had too restrictive or not consistent security. And what's happened is they stop getting invited to meetings, security leaders. They stop at the departments will find workarounds outside of security, almost always. Shadow IT, whatever else they will. They will find, sorry, you want to pet my job? I'm going to continue on, but you're just not going to know about it.
Yeah.
All right. And over again, this is what you happen. And you need to, it's particularly coming from the outside, I can see those things easier than someone inside the organization as I start doing some investigative work on what's happening.
Yeah, and I guess one of the challenges that a company has is, let's say you've gone through SOC 2, you had the basic kind of training, and I've been through this myself. Once you've been through that training, it stops. Then there's no kind of repeat, training in 3 months' time, just to kind of remind you. You do it once, and that's it. You kind of forget about it. There's no sort of consistency with upskilling teams on what they need to be kind of careful of. Is that something that you would do as a CISO in one of your companies? You'd make sure that the company are constantly having this kind of knowledge drip and training sort of fed to them constantly?
Yeah, I don't know anyone who really is a fan of get, do a, the security awareness as a challenge on them, because a lot of this
Mm.
is a compliance box activity where they say, all right, we're going to have you watch a video for a week, check the box, we're done.
Yeah.
But that's not what security, that's not, I don't think, really effective. I think it needs to be a constant kind of reinforcement, and not just from security, from the executives themselves, reinforcement. And it has to be a bunch of series of micro steps leading and moving towards that direction. You have things like, security champions, where you give certain people in different groups additional security training.
Yeah.
Okay. And you'll find a lot of people actually really want this if you get the budget. And so you 10x your security team by expanding the reach of more security experts without adding necessarily to the budget or headcount. So things like that, I think, are worthwhile to look at.
Yeah, I've seen it done really well in a company we work with beginning of this year, where they actually brought a bit of humor to their security training. So
Mhm.
they'd hold monthly regular meetings or workshops, they were called, and the CEO and the CTO would be at the front delivering this training. So it wasn't necessarily an outsider or someone from their security team, but it was delivered by the CTO and the CEO, and they made it quite humorous. They did little skits and little um, little mini workshops that really hammered home the message of what the individual employees need to be careful of and what the consequences of that would be. But it was done in quite a humorous.
You nailed it with, when you have the CEO doing this, it
Yeah,
says everything.
yeah,
It says, when the CEO is talking about security, it dictates down, because everyone looks at what the senior leadership is doing. If you have a senior leadership who doesn't really care, then that
yeah.
it just makes it really, really hard for your CISO or security leader to do cultural change and move towards more of a security mindset.
Last question, Todd.
Yes.
So,
Shoot.
if a CEO is about to raise some money or go through a deal, what's the one simple security step they should take before signing anything? Give them something actionable that they can be doing.
I would reverse that. I'd say the issue is not them signing. The issue is any types of money transfer afterwards. And what I mean by that is there's constantly examples of lawyers getting hacked. All right, the middlemen getting hacked. Their email, the servers are getting hacked, and they are redirecting, having clients redirect their funds. So any kind of fund transfer, anything needs to be triple checked by phone, not by email or chat. And I wouldn't trust any default anything you get digitally without verbally confirming it over the phone. I think
Yeah.
that's where the greatest risk is for any CEO, is after they've signed the agreement and this fund transfer happens.
I can't remember the name. That there was a company in Australia. I think they were a real estate company, and they were just going through a big acquisition. And the PA or the secretary receives an email she thought was from the CEO saying, "Look, the deal's been done. Transfer the money to this amount of money." So the hacker was obviously aware of what was going on. They'd
Yep.
infiltrated the system. They knew this deal was in progress. Without doing what you just said then, without checking, this secretary transferred the money, and we're talking millions of pounds it was. I can't remember the exact number. She transferred the money to this account and then checked afterwards once the money had already been transferred. And it cost this company tens of millions of pounds. So I think that's probably the best bit of advice anyone can take on board.
I would. You'll find oftentimes the find attackers have, they're already in your company and they're just watching. All
Yeah,
right. Just an example. And they're waiting for the right time to strike, and if these type of deals are happening, they're going to know, and they're going to know when to strike. And without the right controls, they just have a greater chance of success.
exactly. And I think that's a very good place to finish. So Todd, thank you very much for all of your insight. I will put all of your social media handles in the podcast notes. If
Cool.
people want to get hold of you, they can connect with you on there. But thank you very much again.
Sounds good. Great talking to you, David. Take care. Bye bye.